As many of you no doubt are aware, the United Nations climate talks, known as COP26, are coming to Glasgow next year. So these were originally scheduled for November this year, but the talks have now been postponed to November 2021 as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic. So first of all, what is COP26? Well, it stands for the 26th Conference of the Parties to the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. And this convention is a crucial multilateral space for governments to come together to respond to the climate crisis. So as we know, greenhouse gases don't respect borders. The climate crisis requires collective action. But the COP is also something of a circus, and we'll be hearing more about this from our speakers as we go forward. So it's a place where government delegations, negotiators, civil society observers, activists, the world's media, corporate lobbyists, powerful interests, which are vested in the status quo, gather to try and influence the outcome of these crucial negotiations. So naturally, it's also a space where global geopolitics are laid bare. So where rich, powerful countries effectively bully poorer countries on the sharp end of the climate crisis and literally make decisions about who is going to live and who is going to die. So the big issues on the table at the COP every year over the last 2 decades, and they will be the issues that are on the table when the COP comes to Glasgow next year, are mostly centered around climate justice and equity. So the United Nations framework recognizes equity and what's called common but differentiated responsibility and capability to act. So this is the idea that rich industrialized nations have greater responsibility for causing the climate crisis, as well as greater capacity to act to curb it, and poorer countries have the right to develop cleanly. So the recurring fights at the COP are around who has to cut emissions fastest, who has to pay and how much in terms of climate finance, carbon debt, climate reparations to the global south. And additionally, the emerging issue of loss and damage, so what happens when communities and countries can no longer adapt to the impacts of climate change and livelihoods and places that people call home are destroyed. So these are big issues that are on the table, have been on the table for some time and will be in Glasgow next year. So obviously COP26, it takes place at a time when the climate crisis is getting visibly worse. So the impacts are becoming terrifyingly real at only 1 degree Celsius of warming. And as we know, current global pledges to reduce emissions put us on a path to a truly catastrophic 3 degrees or more warming. So it takes place, the COP26 is taking place at a time when we are running out of time to act. But it also takes place, more hopefully, at a moment when the movements are getting stronger. So the rise of the youth climate strikers, the rise of Extinction Rebellion in this country, putting climate crisis on the political agenda like never before. So it's also, fortunately, a time of hope. The COP in Glasgow will now additionally take place in the context of the recovery from the global coronavirus pandemic. So the fragility of our current systems and the gross injustices that are entrenched in them have been exposed like never before by the COVID-19 crisis, demonstrating the interlinked nature of the multiple crises of the climate, biodiversity loss, and global and local inequalities. And that's why the COP in Glasgow will now be an even more important moment for all of us to build towards, growing a powerful, unstoppable, diverse movement for just solutions to the climate crisis, and putting the climate emergency at the heart of our demands for a just and green recovery from COVID-19. So that's enough from me just now, and it's time to introduce our speakers. So I'm going to introduce our speakers all at once and then just hand over to them. So, sorry. Our first speaker is Kat Jones, who is the project manager for COP26 at Stop Climate Chaos Coalition. And Kat is going to be reflecting on her experiences at the Madrid COP, so COP25 last year in Madrid. And then we're going to hear from Dr. Ricardo Navarro, Director of SESTA, Friends of the Earth El Salvador, to give a perspective from the global south about the COP and the processes and activities that take place there. And finally, we're going to hear from Simon Anderson for the International Institute for Environment and Development, to hear a bit more about what's on the table in terms of the negotiations at COP26. So over to Kat.
Oh, sorry, I was muted then. So I'd just like to say thank you very much for that introduction, Mary. I just dashed downstairs and told all the children to stop streaming. So I hope that the internet will be strong enough to last this presentation. I was just considering before I started this, how I'm actually really well qualified to do a beginner's guide to COP, because I'm actually a beginner to COP myself. So the idea of this session is really for people who perhaps have not really engaged with COPs before, haven't been to any, like myself, only a few months ago, know pretty much nothing about COPs, apart from they're very, very important for our future living on the planet. So I was very fortunate enough to go to COP in December, my very first, COP25 in Madrid. As you know, you probably know, it had just been switched only 6 weeks previously from being in Chile. So everything that I experienced had been set up within an incredibly short time. I'm going to give you an overview of what COP's like inside the COP and what's COP's like being outside. And I have to acknowledge that it's probably not the same as any COP has ever been, because it was organised so hastily. So I'm not giving you a very rounded view, but it's my own view. So to be able to attend a COP inside and get a badge, you need to be an observer organisation. And Stop Climate Chaos Scotland has been attending COPs for around 10 years. And with me were some of my colleagues from Stop Climate Chaos Scotland, including Mary, including colleagues from SCCS, from Oxfam, WWF, and all sorts of other organisations. And it was wonderful for me to be able to see how civil society can have power within COP, using their international networks. For example, Friends of the Earth Scotland and SCCS very closely connected with Ricardo, who we're going to hear from later, connecting those networks throughout the world and making a real difference. So I'm just going to start by showing you, I don't know how to move forward my slides. There we are. So when I got there, I knew there was a blue zone because that's what I had my badge for. And I went into the blue zone, which is the official space. And all I really knew was, the UNFCCC is having their negotiations. So I went along to one of those to start with. And what I discovered was, where's my, oh, there we are. Was that I was seated in the Croatia space because I'd gone to a session that was so poorly attended, there were practically no countries there at all. And they'd asked the whole audience to move forward into the spaces so that there weren't 100 meters between the presenter and the audience. And this was Earth Information Day. So it wasn't official negotiations or anything like that. It was a UNFCCC event. And then after that, I started looking for other events and found that there were 42 separate websites which I could find out events that were going on inside COP, because every single pavilion and room seemed to have its own website and its own agenda of what was going on. So very shortly after that, I decided to go for word of mouth only and to shadow my colleagues, like Mary, spent a day with Oxfam, a day with Friends of the Earth Scotland, a day with WWF. And that's how I got to find out what was going on. So, importantly, it's really, civil society has an amazingly central role within COP. There's constituencies that have official roles within COP, and I've listed those down the side. And there's also informal groups, NGO groups, that also interact in COP. So we can consider ourselves a very important part of COP, often one perhaps that doesn't seem to have as loud a voice as others, but it is there. And I was really struck by the efficiency and the expertise with which the civil society groups operate together as coalitions and as constituencies. So the pavilions, this is another whole section of COP. So there were two enormous aircraft hangars, is the only way to describe them, rooms full of negotiating rooms. And then there was two huge ones full of pavilions. This is the UK pavilion, and you can see it's very much sort of about pushing forward UK financing. It's about sponsorship. You can see that there's a stall here with videos running from all the sponsors, and this is Foster and Partners. It sort of had that kind of very corporate, very clean sort of invest in the GB. And then there were other pavilions around that had different feels to them. This is India was the biggest that I saw. It had a giant neon Gandhi, and you could have a go at spinning wool like Gandhi did. But also at the same time, you could be sold loads of technology from India's kind of Silicon Valley and things like this. So it's sort of like a little bit of cognitive dissonance. In fact, the whole thing felt to me like a massive exercise in cognitive dissonance. On the right, it's a Scandinavian one made out of wood. There was also, the French one was made out entirely out of cardboard, which was really quite an amazing structure to see. They're shared spaces. So these are spaces that can be used for press conferences. You can see down on the left at the bottom there, that's a Friends of the Earth International press conference from Indigenous leaders. And that was calling for immediate action on Article 6 and other things related to it, which is about carbon trading. It was speaking out against that. And then on the right, you can see there's little stalls that you can rent for a day. This is one by Greenpeace. They're very tiny, and they just have 2 seats and a tiny chair, tiny table. So there's also spaces for meetings, and the constituency groups have regular meetings 2 or 3 times a day in those kind of shared spaces. Within the COP, there are protests going on, and these are 2 photographs of 2 different protests that are some of the allowed protests within COP. So they're given permission by UNFCCC. It's very strictly monitored. When you go in, they search you for banners to make sure that you haven't got anything that you could unfurl in a place you're not allowed to. But also during COP, there was I had an experience of an unofficial protest that took place. This is a picture of it. It's a bit blurry because I think I was a bit blurry at the time, but there was about 400 people gathered in front of the main negotiating hall to protest the lack of movement from world leaders. And this was not allowed by the UNFCCC, and they ended up sending in their people and ended up kettling a group for a while and then sent them out through the doors. Now, on that day, they actually banned the whole of civil society from re-entering COP if they'd left. And when I left to go and check on colleagues who'd been sent out, I wasn't allowed back in, not even to get a bag. So it was a bit of an experience, and I know that those who are more seasoned will have had a lot of these experiences because on some COPs, people have been excluded for long periods. Going out of COP, the green zone, here's a picture of it. There's only one photo because it reflects the amount of time I spent in it. It was a very corporate type of area. And I think that reflects perhaps the time that was available to organise it, and that only corporates were able to get together the money and the exhibitions at short notice to go in there. But it didn't have a lot of atmosphere. I expect that the green zone will be in the Science Centre this year. We haven't got complete confirmation, but we've been told that's the case, in which case it might well be much more engaging and a place for people to go, school trips, people who get up in the morning in Glasgow and go, I wonder what this COP is, would go to the green zone for information. But really importantly to us as civil society in Glasgow, in Scotland and further afield are the activities that go on outside COP, because only a certain number of people get a badge. And I was really fortunate enough to go to the Social Summit and spend a few days there, which was incredibly well organised. In 6 weeks, they managed to get together this tent with 500 spaces. They had food going on. They had amazing programme of events. These are plenaries. And this one is a live link with Chile, because of course Chile had organised and had spent a year or more organising a people summit that of course then the COP was moved. So that took place and we had the live link, and there was a lot of interaction between the two, which was really good to see. Outside there were stalls, there was fantastic food, there was a bit of a social atmosphere, there was a canteen, and it had such a comfortable and a good vibe compared with inside COP, which felt very like businessy, suity, and didn't feel like a comfortable place. And this is what I think is really exciting about COP coming to Glasgow, because we can create, let's say it might not be as sunny as it is in Madrid there, but we can create that kind of warmth and that kind of welcome for activists coming to Glasgow. Protests, of course, they take place. This is Extinction Rebellion on the right, and on the left it's Sustainer Clause. So there's pop-up protests outside COP as you go in on the underground, but also there is, of course, an official march. And the march itself was an amazing experience to be at. 500,000 people. You can see the picture below in the streets. And it was led by the indigenous people carrying a flame in silence. And it was the most affecting thing to see them walk past. I was fortunate enough to be at the head of the march, well, not standing there, but on the side, because I got separated from my colleagues. So I was waiting for the whole march to come through. And so I got to see each constituency and each group as they came through, first the indigenous groups, and then the young people and youth activists and the radical eco-feminists, and as each group came past to the very end where there were the faith groups and the unions, it was a fantastic thing to see. And I'm really excited about when we can host this in Glasgow and what we can do with some of the activities around COP.
Thank you, Kat, and thanks very much for sticking to time. So our next speaker is Ricardo Navarro. And before I hand over to Ricardo, just to remind everyone to, if you have any questions, anything that pops into your head that you want to ask the panel about, please keep putting that into the chat as we go along. Okay, Ricardo, over to you.
Thank you, Mary, and good afternoon, everybody. For us, it's urgent that we find a proper way to deal with climate change. Last week, we had two big rains. Amanda and Cristobal were their names. We had 8 days raining. And in 1 week, we got about 20 to 25% of the rain we're supposed to get in the whole year. That means a lot of crops have been destroyed, a lot of property, houses, roads have been destroyed, people have been killed. And that happens every year in many countries in Africa, Asia, and Latin America. Now, that, of course, is the result of climate change. And climate change has to do with the excessive amount of carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. So we shouldn't emit any more carbon dioxide. We should stop that as soon as possible. That rules out any proposal that corporations bring forward that they want to continue emitting, and they say we're going to pay some people in the south to plant trees. You know, we don't need any more carbon dioxide in the biosphere. So we have to reduce and bring down to zero as soon as possible all emissions of greenhouse gases. That's the first thing we have to say. Also, we have to realize that emissions of greenhouse gases have to do with consumption. So what does that mean? People who consume most, that means wealthy people of the planet, are the main responsible for the climate change in the world. Now, when you have the impacts, they affect more people who are poorer, you know, all the impoverished sectors in the planet. So that means climate change has been generated mainly by the wealthy people of the planet, and poor people are the ones suffering the consequence. That means there is an ecological debt from the wealthy to the poor people. In my country, we have wealthy sectors, and they are much more responsible for climate change than the poor sectors. But in the world, we also have wealthy countries, you know, countries that consume and emit much more CO2 than the countries that are poor, the poorer countries. So that means there is an ecological debt. So wealthy people should provide more resources to deal with climate change, because climate change is not only a technical problem, it's also a social problem, and justice is built. You know, there is all this historical, social, and ecological debt, and that people have to figure out how to provide resources, particularly people who have the resources and are main responsible for the problem, have to provide resources in order to find a proper solution. Now, another thing, we have to realize that climate change for us generates big floods, hurricanes, droughts. For example, now in the Atlantic, the Miami Center they are claiming that we might have between 6 and 10 hurricanes, between 9 and 13 named storms, and probably between 3 and 6 big hurricanes, you know. So that's for this year. And this, they say, is probably going to be worse than the average that we have had in the last 10 years. So that is what we have in the menu here in this part of the world. We have to realize also that all this consumption and emissions of CO2 has to do with our economic system. In the world, we have an economic system, you know, economic growth indefinite. You know, all the countries want to grow indefinitely. Now, the problem is that the planet does not grow. So we cannot have an economic system with all the countries wanting to grow, you know, in economic terms in a planet that doesn't grow. What does that mean? We need to change the economic and the political system of the world. Political because all these economic forces are also political forces, and they are the ones who influence the COP in order not to achieve the agreements that are needed to stop all these climate problems in the world. Finally, I want to say that besides all these environmental problems, we also have problems generated by diseases. When you change the conditions in the climate, all the viruses can go from one ecosystem to the rest of the planet. For example, Zika virus that was in Uganda, and the conditions in the atmosphere change in the world, so the virus now is everywhere. The same goes for coronavirus. Of course, that does not rule out the possibility that some laboratories are also playing with that. You know, that's of course another thing. But what we want to say finally is that we need to change the political and economic system of the world if we want to survive climate change. We have now more than 1 degree Celsius of temperature increase, and that's generating a lot of problems, and certainly the world will not be able to cope with 2 or 3 degrees more. That's going to be really disastrous for all of us. So we have to make plans in order to bring all the carbon dioxide emissions to zero, and other greenhouse gases, of course, and also to bring the component of justice. We have to hear words from the South, from the indigenous people, from women, from peasants, because they're the ones who are suffering the consequences more. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ricardo, for that really sobering reflection on on what's at stake here, right? What's at stake in the COP in Glasgow next year. Over to Simon now, then, for I think you're going to talk a little bit more about the details of the negotiations.
Yes, thanks very much, and great to hear from Ricardo and Kat prior to this. Can I recommend that people that are interested in learning more about the COP process and seeing the analysis of it from a perspective that most of us on this webinar would share, that there's a website that I think you will have access to the links through the materials that I provided to Friends of the Earth, and I'll send them to you. But there's an oxfordclimatepolicy.org website that has a set of publications on, and some of them are very useful for people such as ourselves. They're pocket guides to the UNFCCC itself and to areas, thematic areas under the climate negotiations, including loss and damage. So, what do I want to talk about? I really want to go back into history and just to remind us, how the UNFCCC was set up back in May 1992. It's become the only global framework with global reach to define how the world the world population is going to address climate change and the impacts of climate change. There's now 197 parties. Mary referred to the Conference of Parties. Parties are really countries, nation states. There's now 197 of those that are signed up under the Framework Convention. And the convention essentially sets up a set of institutional arrangements and procedures that allow countries to agree how collectively they will achieve the main objective of the convention, which is the stabilization of greenhouse gas concentrations in the atmosphere at a level that would prevent dangerous anthropogenic, i.e. humankind created interference in the climate system. So the UNFCCC is really an arrangement of nations towards a single objective. The timeline points along the timeline since 1992. There is now an intergovernmental panel on climate change, which is the one that's famous for generating what they refer to as their assessment reports. We're now on the eve of seeing the 6th assessment report. The first one was produced in 1990. You'll remember that in 1997, the Framework Convention generated what was called the Kyoto Protocol. And then in 2015, we have the Paris Agreement. And it's the Paris Agreement that is now really coming into effect from 2020, with a set of working packages on things such as technology transfer, of course, the mitigation, which is what the Framework Convention refers to, how it refers to the reduction in greenhouse gas emissions. We have adaptation, we have finance. So the Framework Convention really allows countries to agree how, under those work programs, progress will be achieved. It's notable that the COPs, the Conference of Parties, are not they're not achieving the success that even those who are the main negotiators would want. Remember back to 2009 in Copenhagen, we had a Conference of Parties that ended in complete disarray. There was huge expectations of what would be achieved at Copenhagen, and in fact, due to various factors, mainly to do with the key players that couldn't agree on progress, Copenhagen ended as a failure. The Paris Agreement then in 2015 allowed us some progress. It allowed progress in some of the main areas, but that progress is really progress on commitments rather than achievements. I want to spend some time, a little bit of time, sort of talking to the principle, one of the principles of the Framework Convention, which Kat mentioned earlier, which is this principle of common but differentiated responsibilities and respective capabilities, CBDRRC, CBDR for short. The common but differentiated responsibilities. This means that the largest share of historical and current global emissions has originated in developed countries, and that the share of developing country emissions will grow to meet their social and development needs. So this is a principle under the Framework Convention, that we recognize that developed countries are the ones that take the onus of both mitigating, i.e. reducing emissions, and supporting adaptation, both in their own countries and outside. But importantly, there is a recognition that developing countries have an ecological space that according to climate justice principles, they will be able to take up. This means that the reduction of emissions by developed countries has to be even quicker to enable social and development to happen in those developing countries. This process under the Framework Convention is subject to review. There was a a set of expert dialogues between 2013 and 2015, and this led to the conclusion that we're now very familiar with, which was the basis for the Paris Agreement, that we need to limit global warming to less than 2 degrees Celsius. In fact, due to the work of the least developed countries group in the UNFCCC, and actually with some support from the European delegation, it was actually agreed that the world would limit warming to 2 degrees and pursue efforts towards a 1.5 degree Celsius warming. 1.5 degrees warming, 0.5 above where we are at the moment, would still have serious impacts on many developing countries. The progress assessments that have happened and will be happening over the next 5, 10, 15 years on a sequential basis are already showing that we're overshooting what is being projected by the Paris Agreement as the course that we should take. A lot of the negotiations, and I think this is an important point, a lot of the negotiations that happen at COP, and one of the things you'll be seeing at Glasgow when it happens next year, is that there is an assumption that we will be achieving Paris targets. And that assumption, unfortunately, the reality is that assumption is not being reached, and therefore we are overshooting. And so it is important to look at the reports of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, look at the scenarios which recognize that emission reductions are nowhere near the rate they should be, and look at the scenarios in terms of climate change related to 3-degree warming, and look at what is projected to happen to food systems, to water systems, to biodiversity, etc., because currently that is the reality that we're staring at. I just want to mention some of the things about the next COP. 2020 is effectively when the Paris Agreement comes into effect, as we have said. We expect to see a set of what is called nationally determined contributions. This is what countries are going to be doing mainly on mitigation, but also on adaptation. There has been a set of NDCs submitted to the UNFCCC already. Those need to be enhanced because the ambition of those isn't sufficient. And the idea is that we will continue to enhance ambition through what they call the ratchet mechanism. So in 2020, or will now be 2021, the COP is supposed to have received a set of submissions on how countries will be more ambitious in terms of meeting addressing climate change impacts. And that is what we expect to see between now and we come to the COP. Because the UK has left or is leaving the EU, the UK itself will generate its own nationally determined contribution. The government has confirmed that the UK will be bringing forward its own increased nationally determined contribution well ahead of COP26. The civil society, that's something that we should be engaging with, and we should be pressurizing the government to indeed do that, and to be comparing what comes out in terms of the UK NDC prior to COP with what the Climate Change Committee has been recommending recently. Alok Sharma, who we know is ironically is the business secretary, who's going to be present of COP26 on behalf of the UK government. He's already said that he expects all countries to submit more ambitious NDCs, that all countries will commit to reach net zero emissions as soon as possible, and developed countries will be honoring their commitments to mitigation, but also to meeting the $100 billion goal for climate finance. These are expectations of the UK presidency of the COP process, and the UK is in the driving seat in terms of making sure those expectations happen. Again, a point of leverage for UK and global civil society. Unfortunately, what we can see in terms of emissions reductions and the record of those observations is that the Paris Agreement is failing to reach is already failing to reach its commitments. But what we also see now in this COVID-19 era is that actually government intervention and social change to a scale that was previously unthinkable can actually happen. Up until recently, we are being told that the scale of climate change action is beyond what governments can afford, beyond what we can achieve now, but actually under different conditions with a more imminent threat, it appears that both state, national reaction and populations' reactions can be of a scale that would give us, I think, encouragement that the climate challenge is one that we can address more concretely than we have managed to do in the past. Finally, on loss and damage, because this is something that we in Scotland would like the Scottish Government to be considering in terms of its role as a co-host of the COP, to be championing. Loss and damage refers to the human-induced climate change, loss and damage to livelihoods and assets. It is a contentious topic within the UNFCCC process because it is wrapped up with liability, who is liable for those losses and damages. But at COP19, a previous COP, there was progress towards setting up an international mechanism to investigate and to work out how loss and damages caused by climate impacts could be addressed. There was a rolling work plan established. Loss and damage was on the agenda of COP25, but the expectation would be that there will be structures and finance put in place over and above adaptation to address loss and damage of countries such as the ones that Ricardo has mentioned, and the current losses and damages, the way that climate impacts are more than the adaptation to climate can cope with. There's loss of damage in lives, assets, etc., etc. So there should be recognition of that in terms of compensatory transfers. What did happen at COP25 was that there was what was referred to as the Santiago network was established on loss and damage. This network could be, and the discussions within this network could be supported by the Scottish Government in the run-up to COP26, where we should be expecting decisions by the COP around how they actually operationalize proper processes over and above insurance to properly compensate people for loss and damages caused by anthropogenic climate change. So we're saying that we want to engage in a discussion in civil society and then with the Scottish Government as to how Scotland can help pave the way for loss and damage to become a recognised part of the UNFCCC process, and achieve agreements on how both institutional infrastructure and funding can be put in place. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Simon. That's fantastic. Okay, so we have about 15 minutes left, and we've had a number of thoughtful questions coming in. So what I'm going to do is a couple of them are sort of covering quite similar territory. So I'll sort of repeat the questions for the panel, and then I think we'll probably only have, we might just have time for one round of responses for the panel, but we'll see how we get on, and if any more questions come in, we can come back. Okay, so the questions that we have so far, there's a couple of questions that are reflecting on Ricardo's contribution. One is asking, where do we start, right? Where do we start to make the change that we need to make? And related to that, what do we think, what does the panel think are the most important things that we can do in Scotland to support Ricardo's work, right? And the work of groups in the Global South fighting for climate justice when you come to the COP in Glasgow. And again, very related to this question, do we have any examples of interventions from civil society at COPs which have been successful in their objectives? Yeah. So a couple of questions in quite a similar sort of territory there. We've also got a question. This is directed at Simon, but again, if anyone wants to chip in answering this, a question around the feasibility of limiting global warming to 1.5 degrees without seriously jeopardizing the current economic and social framework in which we operate.
Okay.
And one more question that I'll throw in there is, we now have an extra year to prepare for COP26, so prepare as civil society for COP26. How can we best use this time to improve the outcomes at the COP? And I think, Ricardo, I'm gonna ask you to start.
Okay, thank you. I believe since the COP is going to take place in Scotland, the Scottish government should facilitate the coming from voices from the South, you know, people from indigenous groups, environmental groups. And I think the Scottish government should provide some funds for that. Also, I think the civil society should talk to the Scottish government that some things like carbon markets should not be allowed, because that means to bring more greenhouse gases into the biosphere, and that is going to be disastrous. Also, I think the civil society in Scotland should make a list of all the corporations that are coming to the COP and denounce them. Because look, big corporations are the main responsible for climate change. And to bring them, and they influence decisions from the government. So to bring them to discuss at the COP is like if you bring a group of criminals to the justice system and ask them how to deal with crime in a country. That's not allowed. I remember in the Framework Convention on Tobacco Control that was led by Gro Harlem Brundtland from Norway, all corporations that produce cigarettes, they were not allowed, because of course they look for their economic interest, you know. So the civil society should say, we don't want corporations in Scotland, you know, to be influencing government, particularly big corporations. I mean, it's okay to bring some, you know, enterprises that, you know, want to give their opinion. I mean, that's okay. I'm talking about the big corporations. They should not be allowed. Also, talking about success, you see, success have to be seen when we achieve something, or when we at least manage to stop something. So things like, if we stop, for example, carbon markets, that'll be a success. We bring all the loss and damages acknowledged, that'll be a success, you know. And we also have to bring, from the scientific point of view, the image, the information that it is very dangerous, the levels of temperature increase that we are reaching. You know, there is a possibility that we can go into runaway climate change. So I think the goal should be to try to bring temperature down. And that can only be if we prohibit consumption of fossil fuels, bring them down to zero, the emissions, as soon as possible. And also bring the justice component. It has to be realized that people in many countries in the South need economic resources. We also have to go for renewable energy sources, certainly, but we need resources to do that, economic resources, technology, and that the influence of the civil society in Scotland should be to try to facilitate that transfer of technology and funds, not only to countries, but also to states within countries, and also to organizations within the countries. Thank you.
Thank you, Ricardo. Kat, would you like to have a go now?
I was just hoping that you wouldn't come to me, actually, because I'd rather like to give the floor to those who've got a bit more experience of COPs. I suppose I'd actually asked that question to Ricardo about how can we be most effective at supporting you know, global civil society in making effective impact at COP. So I'm kind of all ears, to be honest, and I'm just like taking notes, and I'll hopefully drive forward anything that comes out of it.
Thank you, Kat. Then over to you, Simon.
Thanks. I think we need to recognise that what's going to happen at COP26 will be influenced to a very large extent by the negotiations before we get there. The COPs usually ratify what is coming out of the subsidiary bodies which are part of the Framework Convention. There's relatively little negotiation that actually takes place. It's more sort of the finalization of agreements which have been to a certain extent drafted. And so one of the key things that we need to be doing in civil society is keeping our eye on the ball, and the ball actually is in play now. There are processes, meetings, subsidiary body meetings, etc., etc. There was a couple the week before last where things are already being discussed, and there are work packages under the Framework Convention that are at different stages of implementation. So as a civil society, if we're going to be effective in our lobbying for a more effective Framework Convention, then we need to understand the Framework Convention sufficiently to be able to know where the pressure points are, which is one of the reasons why I mentioned the commitments made by Alok Sharma as part of the UK government and to be the COP president. He's put forward his expectations. We need to keep him to those, and that he does as much as he can as COP president to make it come to fruition. Secondly, and here I thoroughly endorse what Ricardo has been saying, there is the need to bring climate justice into the COP negotiations. At the moment, climate justice does not appear in the formal Framework Convention. It is something that countries that are obviously and in fact culpable have refused. And don't forget, this is a UN process where by consensus. So Scotland has created a climate justice fund. It's one of the few countries or few devolved authorities countries that has such a thing. Albeit very small, the Climate Justice Fund does set a precedent. The links between a key Framework Convention negotiation area, which is loss and damage, and climate justice are very, very strong. Therefore, as civil society, we can be talking to government, the Scottish government, about their contribution as co-host of the COP, such that when the Glasgow agreement that follows on from the Paris Agreement comes out, there is something that there is movement reflected in that agreement on loss and damage, and there are some key things which countries parties to the convention are already asking for, and these are to do with what I've explained in terms of the Santiago network and the funding and institutional framework for loss and damage. So there is a certain logic in the Scottish government supporting a dialogue around those issues because of the position it has taken previously on climate justice and the link between climate justice and loss and damage. And finally, one of the key things that we should be doing, and here I agree with Ricardo as well, is that the voice of those people who are on the climate front line at the moment, those in the countries which are getting the most frequent and most severe climate impacts, those voices need to be heard, and their representatives, those that are representing them as delegates of those countries in the COP process, need to be heard. There is a least developed countries group, which the organization I work for, IID, supports legally and technically. They are a voice, as I've mentioned, a voice that was important in getting the 1.5 commitment in the Paris Agreement. The LDC group, as it's known, I would recommend that civil society in Scotland look at what the LDC group is demanding from the COP process, and to see whether you can ally with that as formal representatives of the people who are at the current moment in time in the climate front line.
Thank you, Simon. So we're drawing to an end of the time that we have for this webinar today. There's been a couple more questions come in, I think one of which at least Simon answered anyway in his comments just then. There's another burning question here about how do we find out which corporations are attending COP, and I think the answer to that is pretty much all the worst ones do, right? All the worst climate polluters do, but the way to find out is a bit nearer the time, and it depends on the role that different corporations are playing. So hosts, countries that host the COP, often choose to have a certain amount of corporate sponsorship, and information about that will be available, I think, much closer to the time of the COP. It's often kept a little bit quiet, perhaps for obvious reasons. But in terms of which corporations are attending and participating in side events and all the rest of it, we have to wait until the programs become available in terms of side events and meetings much nearer the time. But you can pretty much bet your bottom dollar that the big baddies, Shell, the big oil majors, etc., will all be there lobbying away in the corridors. So I think we have to close now. I would like to offer Kat just the opportunity to come in with any sort of closing reflections from a Stop Climate Chaos perspective. Kat, would you like to come in?
Yes, thank you. That's been a really, really interesting webinar for me, as much as for all of you as well, I think. I think we've got a huge responsibility. Like I feel the weight upon my shoulders, and I think everybody across SCCS and across wider society in Scotland is feeling that sort of weight that we've got a lot to do here. You know, we've got to support in every way we can civil society that's coming to Scotland, but also we've got to put pressure on our own government in Scotland, but also in the UK, to do all these things. Now, we've been given an extra year, and you know, climate change can't wait a year. But within that year, we now have got more time to get in there and make sure that our governments are doing things themselves that they need to, like just the basics would be handy, but you know, to really extend themselves and set a good example and start to draw along all the other countries with them. But there were some really specific things that Ricardo said about Scottish government. You know, Scottish government needs to be stepping forward and looking at ways that they can bring more people from the countries that are most affected by climate change to Scotland. We know that it's going to be a problem with visas anyway, and we need to be using all the levers that we've got with UK government and Scottish government to do that. And SCCS has got 10-15 years now of experience of working kind of inside track with government doing lobbying, and these are some of the things that we ought to be good at. So we need to get in there and do that kind of inside track lobbying to make sure that the right voices are at COP and that the money is going to support the right people coming to COP and not the polluters and the big kind of corporations. So that's just quickly from me, a final few minutes.
Thank you, Kat. And any last words, Ricardo?
Yes. I would like to propose the Scottish civil society to run an awareness campaign. You know, it'd be nice if that can be spread also to other European nations, but an awareness campaign to tell people how much CO2 corporations are emitting. Food corporations, oil corporations, you know, planes, all that corporation. And how big are the impacts that those corporations are generating in the world? Problems in Africa, Asia, Latin America. You know, and also to denounce that these corporations, sometimes they build NGOs and they come through NGOs, and people think you're dealing with NGOs and corporations are behind it. You see, I believe it's very important for people to know the facts, because most people, sometimes they make wrong decisions because they don't have the information. And if people are aware, they can exert political pressures on their government. I think that is a very important, as I said, a big awareness campaign based on one hand on the science, how really bad the problem is, and on the other hand on justice, how big the impacts climate change is generating. Thank you.
Thank you, Ricardo. And I think that's a really good note, right, to end, to wrap this webinar up on. So just to say then a final thank you very much to all of our speakers this afternoon, or this morning for Ricardo, and to our audience for attending and for these like really thought-provoking questions, and to the team at Stop Climate Chaos Scotland for organising this webinar and for all the tech support in the background. So this is the first in a series of webinars, and we would really like to get some feedback from you to help us design the rest of the event. So we'll be sending out some notes from the event, the recording from the event. We'll send out Simon's slides as well that he talked to, and we'd have a few questions in there just for feedback so that we can bring that into our planning of future events. So we'll share that with you in the coming days. But for now, thanks very much for coming, and goodbye. Enjoy the rest of your days or evenings, everyone.